the National Endowment for the Humanities. The Council seeds, supports, and strengthens public history, cultural heritage, civic education, and community engagement by and for all Rhode Islanders. As a follow-up to tonight's program, tomorrow you will receive an evaluation form by email. Please fill out the evaluation. Our ability to evaluate our programming helps improve our offerings, and it's crucial for fundraising efforts of both PPL and the presenters that we are bringing here to you tonight. Our presenters tonight each brought incredible expertise to this ambitious project. So please check in the chat for a link to their full bios to learn about the many years of experience that brought them to Unladylike 2020. For the sake of time, I will just let you know that tonight we are joined by Unladylike 2020 series creator, executive producer, director, and writer, Charlotte Mangin, executive producer, director, and writer, Sandra Rattley, artist and artistic director, Amelie Chabannes, who is here from France, staying up very late tonight to be with us, and motion graphics animator and artistic director, Joel Orloff, an old friend of PPL. I'm now going to turn it over to our presenters to hear about how they collaborated as a multidisciplinary team to research, recover, and then make visible the lives and dynamism of women who, although famous in their own time, had for the most part disappeared from living memory. Thank you so much, Charlotte, Sandy, Joel, and Amelie, and welcome.
Thank you so much for having us.
All right, I'm going to start the first video. One moment, please.
For the first time in the history of our nation, a political party has nominated a Negro woman for the second highest office in the land.
Charlotta Bass was so far ahead of her time running for vice presidency of this nation. And she used her newspaper to fight for rights across the spectrum. They say I don't act right, it's unladylike, how I wanna live my life.
1912, Los Angeles, California. 24-year-old Charlotta Bass worked at the California Eagle, one of the first African-American newspapers in the state.
She found her way to that newspaper selling subscriptions. The California Eagle was founded by J.J. Nemore in 1879 to support the movement for equality among African Americans.
In 1912, Nemore called Bass to his deathbed.
It was Charlotta that he asked to carry the paper on after his passing, and she made a deathbed promise to him that she would.
Almost overnight, I became owner, editor, and publisher. Who had ever heard of a woman running a newspaper? It was the talk of the town.
Although there's some debate about the year and location, Bass was born Charlotta Amanda Spears in 1888 in Little Compton, Rhode Island. She attended desegregated public schools in Providence and worked selling ads and subscriptions for a Black newspaper, the Providence Watchman.
In the white mainstream newspapers, African Americans were mentioned almost exclusively in stories about crime. That was it. So the Black press provides coverage impossible to find in the mainstream press.
In 1906, Bass moved to Los Angeles, a city booming with the promise of jobs.
Negroes were in search of dignity and civil rights. It was the dawn of a new life in an atmosphere of freedom.
Everybody came to California, starting in the late 19th century. And African Americans were part of those migrations. On the one hand, that period was defined by violence against Black people, the rise of white mobs, lynching, and all kinds of terror. At the same time, this was actually a kind of golden age for African Americans. They were building institutions, publishing newspapers, developing a culture, and flourishing in many ways.
When Bass became one of the first African-American women to own a newspaper in 1912, her first order of business was keeping the doors open.
It was an extraordinary thing for anyone to own a newspaper because of the kind of resources that it took to run the presses and to pay the bills and to just get the newspaper distributed.
Bass hired a veteran reporter as her second in command.
Joseph Bass was an experienced newspaper man. He'd been an editor on an African-American newspaper in Kansas before he migrated to California. Charlotta kept the title of managing editor, and Joseph Bass took care of internal workings of the paper.
They married in 1914. Under their joint leadership, the California Eagle grew from a 4-page tabloid to a 20-page weekly with the largest circulation of any African-American paper on the West Coast.
Every issue that people were facing, whether it was in the schools, in the job market, in housing, not being served in a restaurant, all were reflected in the pages of the California Eagle.
The paper dedicated itself to the task of waging bloodless, but fearless war against segregation and discrimination wherever they raised their ugly heads.
The role the Black press has always had to play is to take Black people from being invisible and to try to push the country through our reporting to be more democratic. My name is Nicole Hannah Jones, and I'm a staff writer at the New York Times Magazine. I got my first letter to the editor published when I was in middle school. I read a column I thought was racist, and I wrote a letter to the newspaper complaining. And I never forgot how empowering that felt to actually see my name in print. So the only reason I ever wanted to be a journalist was to write about racial inequality. I've done that with housing segregation, with school segregation, and the 1619 Project, which I created to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the first Africans being sold into the United States. Every single story in the magazine starts with America today and shows how these things about American life that you think are unrelated to slavery actually are. It was an effort to show that virtually nothing has been left untouched by the legacy of slavery and the American story. We were founded not as a democracy, but as a slaveocracy. I earned the Pulitzer Prize for my opening essay, which is on how Black Americans are the perfecters of democracy.
Charlotta Bass took a lot of risks in the work that she did. Southern California was one of the main fields where the Klan was recruiting, and she called them out on a regular basis in the pages of the newspaper. And she suffered a campaign of harassment and threats.
One night in 1925, Bass was working alone when 8 hooded members of the Ku Klux Klan showed up at the paper's offices.
She pulled a pistol out of the drawer of her desk and pointed at them.
I had never handled a gun before and wasn't quite sure which end to point at the intruders, but they evidently thought I might know how to shoot, and all 8 beat a hasty retreat.
Her husband told her, "You're going to get me killed one day, Mrs. Bass." And she always told him, "Well, Mr. Bass, it will be in a good cause."
After Joseph Bass died in 1934, Charlotte Bass ran the newspaper by herself for another 2 decades and became more involved in electoral politics.
She joined committees, she marched on picket lines, she lectured, she ran for city council, she ran for county office.
In the 1930s and 40s, Bass helped win a series of victories for equal rights, including ending employment discrimination at various LA companies.
Black people, and particularly Black women, are still vastly underrepresented in mainstream newsrooms. And that is why I helped co-found the Ida B. Wells Society for Investigative Reporting, to do away with that one excuse that we hear all the time, which is we'd love to hire more Black investigative reporters. We just can't find any who are qualified. We've trained hundreds of journalists in the skills of investigative reporting. If we are not presenting our own communities, then other people will shape the way that our stories get told, what doesn't get told, and how the larger world sees us.
After being a member of the Republican Party for 30 years, Bass was frustrated by its lack of progress on civil rights. In 1948, she became one of the founders of a left-wing third party dedicated to ending segregation and protesting President Truman's Cold War policies. Bass ran for Congress in 1950 on the Progressive Party ticket. She lost, but didn't stop there.
In 1952, she actually ran for the office of the Vice Presidency of the United States with Vincent Hallinan on the Progressive Party ticket. There wasn't a chance in hell that they were going to win, much less get a lot of votes. But she took every opportunity she could to have her voice heard and to bring the kind of social justice that she thought was needed.
It is with great pride that I come before the American people at this moment. For the first time in the history of our nation, a political party has nominated a Negro woman for the second highest office in the land.
Bass was labeled a radical. The federal government investigated her as a potential communist. The post office tried to revoke her postage permit for the California Eagle. She sold the paper in 1951, and it continued publication until 1964.
I am very confident that within my lifetime, I will see first-class citizenship achieved for all my people, true democracy for all Americans.
She's really been erased from national memory.
In her 70s, Bass transformed the garage of her home into a community reading room and voter registration site. Living long enough to witness the legislative victories of the civil rights movement. Bass died in 1969. She was 81.
What most inspires me about Charlotta Bass is her fearlessness. She had such a sense of obligation, not just to her own people, but to justice. I think she certainly helped create a path for someone like myself to exist.
I believe in a world of good, The battle is not won nor the struggle past, but I know the future will be even better.
Say I don't act right, it's unladylike, how I wanna live my life.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much. So that was the first of the films, of the 3 films that you'll be seeing tonight. I am the creator of Unladylike2020. Charlotte. I had the idea several years ago when my 2 little boys and I discovered a children's book named Soar Eleanor about Eleanor Smith, the youngest licensed pilot in the world in the 1920s. And interest in her led me to research other women in aviation and women in other professional fields. And the project just grew and grew into this treasure trove of stories. And when I realized that the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage was coming up in 2020, I thought that was the perfect time to bring these extraordinary stories back to life. So I soon brought on Sandra Rattley, who is an executive producer that I've worked with for many years on PBS projects, as well as Amelie Chabannes, a friend for what, 20 years now, Amelie?
Yeah.
Who is an extraordinary artist. And I both wanted to create a really signature look that would make history exciting and provide a new visual approach to historical documentaries, but also help fill in the visual gaps, because we went out of our way to choose women who didn't necessarily make it into the history books, and therefore archive was very limited. After 3 years of fundraising, 2 years of research and development, and a year and a half of production and post, Unladylike became a series of 26 shorts. They're all about 10 to 12 minutes long, that PBS American Masters, the flagship biography series on public television, released digitally, 1 a week for the 26 weeks between the start of March, Women's History Month, and August 26th, which was the actual centennial of the date that the 19th Amendment was written into the Constitution. And we also created a 1-hour television special focused on 5 of the women who were politicians and activists. And now we've moved into a phase of impact in education. We created curriculum and lesson plans for middle and high school students that are being pushed out through PBS Learning Media, which is a free educational platform from PBS. And we hope to inspire a new generation of students with these stories. So I'll hand it off to Sandy to tell you more.
Well, we're very grateful to Charlotte for having this dream. And we're very happy to be here tonight with all of you. And thanks to PPL for making this happen. So we really had a very lean team considering how ambitious the project is. So there were 25 of us, women-led, a majority women of color. In the 25, we had 5 men, one of whom was our most dedicated graphic motion animator, Joel Orloff, who contributed so much to our visual vocabulary. And the men were just as dedicated and committed to trying to make this dream become a reality as the women on the team. So we had 3 teams. We had 3 editors and 3 researchers and associate producers. And they each had about 8 women each that they were researching and also editing the shorts. We had 2 assistant producers and a 3-person archival team. Charlotte and I were really kind of the gatekeepers for the storytelling, for the narrative and editorial oversight, trying to ensure cultural competency, authenticity, obviously accuracy. And we were also working closely with WNET, getting feedback. But in terms of the artistic vision and the coherence, as Charlotte said, really creating a signature look, we were very interested in making sure that history was really told in a different kind of way, in a way that would appeal cross-generationally and would be exciting and fast-paced. So the four-person artistic team led by Amelie and Joel, and with Charlotte and I really were successful, we believe, in creating a unique artistic vision. So the four of us really had our hands in each one of the 26 shorts, while our other team members were, again, working more or less as clusters. We were very successful despite COVID, because we got all of our interviews and our production done really before the shutdowns. And we were all working remotely. We had one person in the Bay Area, one in Puerto Rico, I'm in DC, Joel's in Rhode Island, Amelie's in Paris, and the majority of our team were in New York, but we were able to really work remotely successfully. And I'm gonna hand it off to Amelie, who's going to give a little introduction about her background and her vision for Unladylike.
Yeah, thank you, Sandy. Thank you so much to PPL for welcoming us like that. It's amazing to be all together and to share this incredible journey. I'm an artist, French-American artist. I'm based in Brooklyn, New York. I used to work for years with more like a fine art kind of process. So I was working with galleries and museums when things were going very well. So it was going from group shows to shows and to fairs. And mostly I was using drawing and sculpture for years. And I was really into this, you know, art world, much more like academic and classical kind of like, you know, the thing that you do as an artist, as a fine art artist. When Charlotte came to me like 6-7 years ago, telling me about the research she was doing about all those women, and she was really at the very beginning of it, and I got completely mesmerized and haunted and drawn by it, because I thought it was absolutely like vital and unique, and it seemed like to me like this, you know, new beginning of an adventure together could be absolutely like wonderful. And I just, for a few years, finished all the work I had to do with the galleries I was working with, because I was represented in Paris, in LA, and in New York. And we started to do the development together like a few years ago, until we got really in the heart of the production a year ago. It was really my first media kind of animation project. I never did that before. But I used to draw for so many years that I was pretty confident that it would work. But the craft was, you know, something very adjustable to me. The most important was the quality of Sandy and Charlotte's work, and the stories behind, and all the script they started to gather. And so I didn't hesitate at all to kind of like put everything on pause for a few years, I would say. Like, no, I mean, like for 2-3 years, it was on the side. And then we had really like a year, like full into the production. So that's about the path that, you know, like led me to Unladylike 2020, basically. Let me know, guys, if you think I should add up something.
No, that's great. Joel?
Hi, yeah. So I'm. It's fun to be here because I live in Providence. So it's really nice to be doing something with PPL. I was the last person of the four of us to join this team. My intro into like doing animation for documentaries came doing the animation for a documentary called Witness Theater that a director named Oren Rudofsky made, who's actually here, I think, in the audience. Hi, Oren, thanks. And I was really excited to work on this for a couple of reasons. The first thing that excited me about it was just Amelie's work. When I watched the trailers and those sort of early things, I just loved her drawings and her the quality of her line work, which is, you know, comes across as someone who's spent years and years drawing. And I also was really excited about the quality of the editing in the show. It seemed like fast paced and high octane in a way that documentaries don't usually feel in my experience. And I think it ended up continuing to feel that way.
Beautiful. So on that note, another high octane film. This one is about Sissieretta Jones.
All right, one moment, everybody. One moment, please.
Sissieretta Jones was the leading African-American singer of her generation and one of the first African-American women to perform at Carnegie Hall.
Say I don't act right, it's unladylike, how I wanna live my life.
1892, New York, New York. 24-year-old Sissieretta Jones sang opera at the newly built Madison Square Garden Concert Hall to an audience of thousands.
Unfortunately, we have today no recordings of her voice. There were very few African Americans who recorded at that time, but we have many descriptions of her voice from the press, how powerful it was and the emotion and the sympathy that you could hear when she sang.
Madison Square Garden was really the big turning point in her life. This prima donna with her beautiful silk gowns, her hair coiffed, the long gloves, and the medals across her chest to say in her subtle way, yes, I have accomplished this.
I woke up famous after singing at the garden and didn't know it. Singing to me is what sunshine is to flowers. I give out melody because God filled my soul with it.
Jones was born Matilda Sissieretta Joyner in 1868 in Portsmouth, Virginia, just after the end of the Civil War. Her parents were devout Methodists. Her father, a pastor, had been born into slavery.
In 1876, the family moved to Providence, Rhode Island, where her father had been offered a ministerial position. They went north looking for a better life than in the South.
Jones began singing in the church choir at an early age.
After singing a solo at a Sunday school concert, some people said to my mother, the child sang a high C. You should let her learn music.
Maybe it was a benefactor at the church who got the money together. She went to the Providence Academy of Music and got some vocal training.
She married a hotel porter in 1883 at age 15 and had a daughter who died as a baby. In 1886, Jones pursued additional vocal training in Boston. She began touring music halls throughout the Northeast to great acclaim. and was hired by a white manager as the lead vocalist of the Tennessee Jubilee Singers, performing arias, gospel, and popular tunes.
She'll be limited to concert appearances because there isn't any opportunity for her to sing in opera. Opera companies weren't hiring African-American singers, and most white American musicians were not going to appear on the same stage with Sissieretta.
In 1888 and 1890, Jones and the troupe toured throughout the Caribbean to packed, racially mixed concert halls. The second tour was managed by an all-Black team, including her husband.
That's where she was given the title of the greatest singer of her generation. And she was given all of these medals and precious jewels.
And the more she acquired, the more she pinned on her chest.
Jones soon became known as the Black Patti, a comparison to Italian opera star Adelina Patti.
Opera was a European art form. And so her manager decided this was the way we were going to promote her. And unfortunately, it stuck throughout her entire career.
It rather annoys me to be called the Black Patti. But I have a voice, and I am striving to win the favor of the public by honest merit and hard work.
To be so gifted in these times as a Black person, I can imagine was one of the most frustrating things, because she couldn't just be Sissieretta Jones. She had to be the Black Patti, which was demeaning. My name is Janae Bridges, and I'm a mezzo-soprano opera singer. Recently, I made my Metropolitan Opera debut, singing Queen Nefertiti in Akhenaten by Philip Glass. The first time that I walked onto the stage, I think my heart skipped a beat, maybe 3, but it really felt like I was home. I like to call myself an opera athlete. We are our instruments. As an opera singer, we're unamplified. And so singing for these 4,000-seat opera houses, you have to literally sing from your toes to your head. And it takes great strength.
In 1892, Jones sang at the White House for President Benjamin Harrison and reportedly performed for 3 other US presidents. The following year, she became the first African-American woman to headline a concert on the main stage at Carnegie Hall, slated on the same program as noted abolitionist Frederick Douglass.
One of the highest honors I've received is being invited to perform at Carnegie Hall. In 2018, I made my solo recital debut, and to think that she had stood on that stage in the hardest of times in America really kind of brought it full circle to me. It almost felt like she gave me her blessing.
After touring Europe, where she performed for emperors, kings, and princes, the tide of Jones's career turned. The U.S. Supreme Court's 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson ruling ushered in a new era of segregation and racial violence.
Even having sung for 4 presidents, racism at that point with the Jim Crow laws made it 10 times more difficult for her to succeed.
They tell me that my color is against me, but I am proud of what I am.
At a time when minstrel shows performed in blackface stereotyped and demeaned Black culture, Jones became the star of the Black Patti Troubadours, a popular vaudeville show made up of 50 African-American acrobats, comedians, dancers, and trained singers.
For the next 19 years, she was on the road They would travel by rail and they would go from one city to the next, 42 to 45 weeks a year, 5 or 6 cities in a week.
She faced extreme discrimination, unable to stay in hotels. So they had to eventually get their own train car, so she would sleep in her train car.
Segregation not only affected how the Black Patty Troubadours traveled, but also how audiences saw the show.
The white audiences, of course, sat in the orchestra, and the Black audience sat upstairs. And there weren't that many white audience members, but they would not allow the Blacks to come and sit in those chairs.
Why, putting the colored people off in the gallery and leaving all those vacant seats downstairs. I think people of my race ought not to be shut out this way.
Opera houses for the longest time have pretty much looked like one thing, and that is older white people. I have seen people look down on African Americans in this field because they might think that this isn't our art form. And it's just not true. Opera is for everybody, and it should represent our community. It should represent America.
Jones retired from the stage in 1915 to care for her aging mother in Providence. Despite being the highest paid African-American performer of her time, Jones had to sell her medals and properties to survive until her death in 1933. Benefactors and fans raised money to place a headstone on her grave in 2018.
I'm completely convinced that without Madame Sissieretta Jones, there would be no Marian Anderson. There would be no Leontine Price. There would be no Jessie Norman. There would be no me. She not only changed the opera world, but she changed history. What a queen.
We come through the furnaces of affliction and persecution and become as gold tried in the fire. As the crushed rose emits the sweetest perfume, so the Negro, bruised and beaten, sings the sweetest songs.
They say I don't act right. It's unladylike. How I wanna live my life.
So we're going to, I guess the term is kind of get under the hood a little bit and have a conversation about how we really created these stories. So as we already described, we had to produce 26 films, basically one a week in a year. And Amelie took 1 week to generate the art images, which she handed off to Joel, who then had a week to create the animations. We had another week in terms of dialogue back and forth for corrections and adjustments. And also Amelie created punctuations, which were color that was added to highlight the women we were featuring or some of the action in their stories, adding color to the black and white stills. So Charlotta and I wrote the scripts for all 26 shorts, and we did the interviews with the historians and the modern day counterparts. And in the scripts, we did include our wish list of what visualization we wanted included in terms of the archival, what we wanted our archival team to find in terms of archival documentation, and also our wish list for Amelie and Joel about the scenes we wanted them to create. So this is a process that it's pretty amazing what we were able to accomplish in such a short and kind of short period of time that we were working feverishly. And oftentimes there were 4, 5, or 6 different versions of each film being created, from the rough cut to the fine cut to the picture lock and to the version that you finally saw tonight. So Charlotta is going to share how our process was in really coming up with the scenes that we wanted to have animated.
Thanks. So yes, so as Sandy mentioned, you know, this constant tension between schedule, our ambitions, the volume of work, quality control, consistency. We had a team of 8 humanities scholars who joined the project early on, who are historians of the progressive era, the turn of the 20th century in US history, as well as women and gender studies experts who were also, you know, watching cuts and giving us notes to ensure historical accuracy, as well as WNET weighing in on the visual approach. So we were also, you know, there was the internal team process as well as external quality control happening. So once the scripts were drafted, I would create what we called animation guides. And I'm actually going to share my screen to show you the one for Annie Smith Peck, who's the mountain climber that you'll be seeing the last film about. One second, let me share screen. There we go. Okay, so you see this was created in March. Her episode aired, I think in June or July, if I'm remembering correctly. So by the time we handed it off to Amelie and Joel, we tended to be at what we call rough cut stage. So the editor would have already created the structure based on our script and plugged in as much archival imagery as we had, which allowed me to then estimate the length of gaps that we had to fill with animation. So we started each film always with a portrait. So, you know, each time I was providing the dimensions that it had to be, the length, 10 seconds in this case. And we wanted Annie Smith Peck circa 44 years old because the scene with which we start the film, she's in her 40s. And whenever possible, I was providing archival images that to inspire Amelie visually and also ensure that, you know, everything from what the pants should look like to the pickaxe and the boots that she's using and the mountains that she is climbing all look correct. And I'm just going to dive. So she's climbing the Matterhorn. So you know, sometimes I had to use modern day images to show what the Matterhorn would look like. And then contrasting her wearing pants to the long skirts that women at the time used to wear. And we're going to dig in deep to a few of the animations in particular. So let me just scroll down to them. So we had, on average, there were about 10 animations per film. Oh yeah, here are the boots and the nails that she would have poked through them as crampons. Okay, so the first animation we wanted to kind of deconstruct for you is called Campsite, which you'll see in the film. And so what we hear is her biographer saying, when she hired men, they were always questioning whether she knew what she was talking about. No matter who she was with, at the end of a long climb, she was the one who was expected to spend 2 hours getting the snow to boil and cooking and cleaning up afterwards. There was always a power struggle. So our instructions to Joel and Amelie were animation of Peck cooking at campsite, men complaining and questioning her. So then we would meet as a team and discuss, okay, what can we show? And based on the conversation and Amelie and Joel kind of reining in, you know, how much action is actually possible in the 16 seconds that you have, and how many drawings is it going to require. We would come up with, okay, and sometimes we would try to reuse existing drawings from other episodes as much as possible. So we decided, okay, we'll need a wide shot of the base camp. We'll need the tent and some men, a snowy background. We already had a pot that Amelie had created for another episode. So we'll take that pot, create the fire, flickering flames under the pot. We need hands, a snowball that Joel would then be able to cut up and show melting in the pot. And then a wider shot for a foreground, seeing her in silhouette. So that's the first one. And the second one that we're going to deconstruct for you, we called Suffrage. And we would be hearing the narration. She became president of a suffrage league and in 1911 planted a Votes for Women banner at the top of Peru's Mount Corapuna. So that had to last 6.5 seconds. So our instructions were animation of Peck planting a suffrage banner at the top of a mountain. And based on our conversation, we came up with the plan. We're going to have a close-up of a hand planting the stick in the snow, and then a wide shot based, you know, inspired by the photo below, which is actually them at the top of Mount Corapuna, but omitting her male counterparts, giving her sole credit for planting the banner. So, and this is how she would have been dressed to keep warm. So let me just check my notes, see if there's anything else I wanted to say. Yeah, and so in this weekly editorial meeting, we would really discuss and resolve any creative differences that we might have and make decisions about what would actually be possible and sort of adjust how much motion and, you know, and so on. So for instance, one of the animations, the original idea was to show a woman in one of those long skirts tripping, but Joel said, oh, that motion of tripping is going to be too complex. So in the end, we relied on the archival images, which were so gorgeous. And I also wanted to mention that because of the volume of work, Joel and Amelie both had part-time assistants who were helping them with scanning and organizing, and as you'll see when we show you the drawings, actually cutting out the drawings to prepare them for animation. So Amelie, I'll hand it off to you and cue me into any images you want me to share on my screen. Amelie, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Sorry, guys.
No problem. We can hear you now. Yes.
No, sorry. Yeah, because I didn't want to, you know, disturb anything when we were like watching the episode. So sorry about that. Yeah, you were talking about like all the images, you know, when about deconstructing Annie Smith Peck sequences, I think, to show the layers that I was drawing and then Joel had to deal with and animate would be like a great idea. I don't know if you have them like around.
Yes. Do you want me to share my screen?
Yeah, I think so. Like with the sky, one layer was the sky, then the summits or the mountains, then the characters. So yeah, we had to separate a lot of like, that's one of the summit. Oh, that's, yeah.
So for instance,
around the Cervino, the Matterhorn. Yeah, that's the Matterhorn. So yeah, one layer is that, then the sky behind, we'll see that later. And then
so you can tell, for instance, this is the drawing, and then this is the drawing once it's been cut out, the masking process.
Masking process, and then just her, I would like draw her
shadows to show different
with several different shadows on each character, to have a vibration. We were like trying to get with Joël like a lot of like vibration and light moving, and then swirls as well.
This is the campsite, Amélie, if you want to show background.
So those ones are basically like
the fire,
the separate layers. But Joël would typically like animate, make, move the flames, or this one actually is like almost a stop motion, maybe. Yeah. So yeah, it's
the
you
ball.
know, it's
So
yeah, it's the fundamental of animation. It's a tricky process where everything has to be separated. Joël like helped me a lot to guide me into that, because I was not very familiar with it. So to just think all the time how things are layered, so the animator can really like, you know, get into the drawing and play with everything, the lights, the background, the foreground, etc. So the character typically like right there is done in several, when she was
that's
like melting the snow in the, that's the sky, and then the background characters. So every sequence requires a lot of drawings. Annie Smith Peck, we found very good systems together, because, you know, the way we work with Joël, first of all, like Sandy and Charlotte were giving, with the script that you showed earlier, the guidelines, you were giving the tones, the tunes, basically. And then Joël and I, it's a little bit like an orchestra. Then Joël and I, we were like, you know, I play hobo, you play violin, like how do we play together? Kind of, you know, how to like make the music become something interesting altogether. So the very beginning of all this process, at the beginning of the production of the episode, was really a race to find out our craft and settle down the best and quickest choices we could ever found, like together, because it was, you know, the deadlines were very, very like tight. So it was very interesting. In the same time that, you know, some episodes required like a lot of drawings. Like we were doing the math the other day with one of them that I probably did like what, 800 plus images. But sometimes we could, and along the way, we found a way to make sometimes for some sequences less drawings, not necessarily like 30 or 20, but like maybe like 3 or 4 or 5, you already have the sense of the movement, so not just one. And then Joël like would like beautifully animate it, like, you know, just a very slow movement, like you can see in Sissieretta Jones when she sings, and it's just the arms that slowly lift up. So being minimalist, you know, sometimes with animation can work very well as well. And so it was all about like finding our tunes and working together that way. Through the lack of time, we had time, but it was just a bit tense. So, and find that alchemy that worked in a superb way. And it was a bit experimental, like in a sense, because during the development, I tried a lot of different things, a lot of different like mediums, like I use like charcoal, and then I tried with watercolor, or
I'm gonna actually share my screen again to show
that
time lapse of Amélie doing a watercolor portrait while you talk.
But very quickly in the drawing, I had to make choices that would work with all the, you know, the frame we had in front of us. So basically, like, voilà, watercolor. I use a lot of watercolor because it's very fluid. It's you drop a lot of water, you put the pigments, and it just spreads into the portrait. So it's a very quick choice decision thing that works very well with watercolor. Thick paint also for all the hair and sometimes the clothing. I would say that charcoal would be like much more into like characters, like you see in Annie Smith Peck when she's standing. You were showing, you know, the different layers. When she's standing on top of the summit, she would basically like begin charcoal, because charcoal is easy to used for vibration during for one character, but repeated like many ways. So I had at the end, I had a whole like list of watercolor goes for that, watercolors goes for landscape, sky, and then characters go with the charcoal, or they go with a certain type of paint. So everything was kind of like, they were an experiment, but everything was pretty much like very defined along the way. And then Joel, of course, was coming as the magician to put all that into movement. But the most important thing for me was to really like try to find vibration, light, as much work with light. Light is very important, especially like shadows and shades as well, because like we're starting with archival images. Sometimes they're very bright. They're not necessarily done by fine art artists, so they're not necessarily like artistically interesting. So it was really hard to transform that to like, you know, something more organic and more mysterious as well. So that was basically like the process, I think.
So then it would get handed off to Joel. Joel, do you want to describe your?
And all that body of work would end up like in the hands of Joel, like, you know, with the poor Joel who had to deal with so many drawings, or so much magic to bring to it, you know, like, and of course, his second phase with him was absolutely like crucial. It was the most important. So it was, yeah, very like interesting alchemy and teamwork.
Yeah, so I would get it. There was actually a step between me getting it, between Amelie finishing it and me getting it, which was also crucial. Which was that the intern who became actually just, I think she's credited as an animation assistant.
Audrey was unbelievable. Yeah, sorry I forgot about her, but I never forget about her, but like I forgot to tell about her. Like she's, oh yeah, of course.
Yeah, and so she would,
yeah.
She did a lot of the prep work for me to
so much
take on the animation process. Like she would go in, I think, as Charlotte showed with the image of Annie Smith Peck on top of the mountain. She would go in and cut out things that were going to have to be on top of other backgrounds and layers. And sometimes she would do that based on my instructions, but more often, especially as we went on, she just sort of like had her own sense of what needed to be cut out and what needed to be done, which was so great that she was so on top of the steps that were required to animate things. So then once I got these things, I was working with them primarily in Adobe After Effects, which is a creative cloud software, and then a little bit in Photoshop if I needed to do any like retouching or you know, fine-tuned cutting things out or cutting things apart. So I sort of, I mean, as Amelie said, we came to a kind of, over time, we got ourselves a bigger and bigger toolkit of the things that really work to communicate Amelie and Charlotte and Sandy's vision for how these things should move and look. So we found out that we could often like create little, like I could create little cutout puppets out of things sometimes. So in the campsite scene, Charlotte, I don't know if you want to.
Yep, I can screen share that. Sure.
Campsite. That's an example. This is an example of a couple of different techniques that we found that work pretty well. So
share.
There's a character in the front. Oh, well,
so this is version 1.
Right. So there I've cut apart the snowball, and now I've made a puppet out of this figure, you know, cutting it out at the different joints, and which allowed me to kind of move it around. as if it's like a stop motion puppet, you know, that you might make out of paper and pins. And then right here it is again. So this was after I got
the final version after some revisions.
Right, so like in that first shot, you can see we added some blue to the snow because I think Charlotte, maybe did you feel it was too white before, or maybe somebody did. You can see also in the background there, one of the tools that two tools that I used, one being blurring out things in the background or the foreground to create a little more depth. And then also this kind of swirling effect that we would do to the backgrounds and other things a lot. Right, and then there's this, you know, it turned out that water was really fun to animate. There's the fire that Amelie made, and I've sort of like made it wiggle a little bit. Yeah, so that's, oh, and then you can also see in that first shot and here also these digital shadows that that was what we called them, where I would either like make a shape that was similar to the figures or use the figures but translucent and dark to kind of locate them in the spaces that they were in.
And Joel, explain the breathing lines also.
Oh yeah, so breathing lines is an animation term that usually refers to when you have hand-drawn animation. If you've got like a static image and then you draw it like, you know, 3 or 4 times and then loop those drawings so you get a little bit of wiggle in the lines. And so we were using that as a way to add, you know, in the same way that we were doing these swirls in the background, we were using it as a way to kind of add life to static moments. So sometimes that would be Amelie actually drawing lines. Sometimes it would be using like a digital effect to make things wiggle. Here, what you can see, it's not quite breathing lines, but in that first shot and here, Amelie would make 3 or 4 versions of this one drawing, you know, and do different charcoal shadows on them, which I could then loop and blend together so that it's almost like there's a kind of like shifting light on the figure. And I think we ended up feeling really happy with that. There's also in this one, some like smoke that I had done like a motion guide of, and then Amelie went in and painted it, which I think we used in like a bunch of different episodes. And then the same with the flag was a motion guide that I had done and Amelie drew.
I'm thinking because it went through the most differences. Do you want? I'm just going to show these 3 iterations of the one that we called climbing.
Yeah,
so
right.
This is the first one where she has just a walking stick and then the boot, the pickaxe, and she's on top of the Matterhorn.
And there's that fog again.
So that was the first one. Effect. And then I think Sandy and my notes were like, it looks too easy to have her just on this incline. And right. Somehow the pickaxe disappeared. The walking stick disappeared. Then we thought, you know, we should loop the motion, like she seems to get there too fast.
Right.
And then in the end, the final version,
she has her pick. Now she has a different pickaxe.
Yeah, we added a pickaxe and this foreground so that it looks, you know, like a more complicated. And then another
fun thing to just notice there when she sticks the pickaxe into the wall, there's some little bits that fly off, which I think it's only one image of like things, and if we go through it bit, like, you know, frame by frame, you'll see that they're actually just rotated and moved. And this is one of the advantages of the like low frame rate that we used, is that in such a low frame rate, you can sort of create chaotic motion like that without having to redraw the pieces every time. Because as it goes past, you just see like this spray of shards.
Is there anything else you want me to share?
I think it's time for us to share
the actual film. Okay, great. Enjoy. And I should mention while we're waiting, today is Annie Smith Peck's birthday. Janae, there's no sound.
(1895) Zermatt, Switzerland. 44-year-old Annie Smith Peck summited the Matterhorn, one of the most dangerous peaks in Europe.
While there were some women before her who climbed the Matterhorn, she became famous or infamous pretty quickly because she climbed in pants. In 1895, there are women being arrested for wearing pants in public and actually being jailed for it. There were stories of women falling into these large crevasses because they tripped on their long dresses or skirts. And really, she just looked at it from a safety angle and thought, why not use the same safeguards that men are using?
Step by step up the rocky walls, where so many travelers have lost their lives. It was indeed a moment of satisfaction to stand upon the famous peak, more than 14,000 feet above the sea.
Annie Smith Peck was born in 1850, the youngest of 5 children in a prominent Rhode Island family. As a teenager, she regularly attended lectures on women's rights and racial justice.
Her favorite lecturer was a young woman by the name of Anna E. Dickinson, who was an abolitionist and a suffragist. There was no television or radio, so people stood in line for hours to get seats at these different lectures. It was the entertainment of the time.
I made up my mind that I should never marry, and that it would be desirable for me to get my living as any boy would do. If I am ever to be anybody or do anything, the time is now.
Despite her family's initial objections, Peck chose to pursue higher education.
During this time, people believed that it was dangerous, physically dangerous. If women participate in education, they will use all of their energy on their brains, and it will be sucked out of their reproductive system, which would eventually render the United States infertile. Her father and her 3 brothers attended Brown, and she figured that she would follow in their footsteps. But when she wrote to the president, he wrote back and said, "We do not encourage education for women." So Brown was out, but the University of Michigan had just opened its doors to women in 1871. So that's where she headed.
I decided that I would do what I could to show that women had as much brains as men and could do things as well if she gave them her undivided attention.
In 1881, Peck graduated from the University of Michigan with a master's degree in classical languages.
Then she applied to the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, Greece. She was the first woman accepted to study there and spent a year there and ended up climbing different mountains throughout Europe.
Peck returned to the U.S. and became a professor of Latin at Smith, one of the first all-women's colleges.
But she figured out she was not ever going to make the same amount of money that her brother made teaching. And so she set her sights on the lecture circuit.
My home is where my trunk is. It is of very little consequence to me that my actions puzzle some people. I shall not stay at home simply to stop their wondering.
She started in antiquities, but once the mountain climbing came more into focus, she would lecture on mountain climbing, and she drew big audiences. And her method was lecture circuit, save up, go explore, spend every last dime she had doing that, and then repeat.
In the 1890s and 1900s, Peck climbed a dozen mountains throughout Europe and Latin America.
In 1897, she heads to Mexico and climbs Mount Orizaba, which gives her the altitude record for women. And so then she thought, well, I've climbed where no woman has gone. My next logical step is to go where no man has gone.
She wasn't just attracted to any mountain, she was attracted to going to places that had not been climbed because she realized the power of being there first. My name is Vanessa O'Brien. I am a mountaineer. I have a Guinness World Record for the fastest female to climb the 7 summits. I then continue to the North and South Pole. I made it to the top of K2 in 2017, becoming the first American and first British woman to do so. When you're actually climbing, you're so focused on survival, you can't even imagine the conditions. You are living outdoors for 6 to 8 weeks. There is no shelter, and the cold is anywhere from 0 to -40. It's really just a miserable experience the whole time. And then once you arrive, it's incredibly rewarding because you did it, and you did it against all odds.
In 1904, Peck set her sights on Mount Huascarán, the highest peak in Peru. She experimented with out-of-the-box ideas to overcome the weather challenges and high altitudes.
Annie Peck wore leather boots 4 sizes too large to accommodate 4 pairs of woolen socks. And she'd take the bottom of the boots and have nails hammered in, and those would give her traction on the ice.
Sometimes mountain climbers, like poets, may be born, not made. I climb not simply for the pleasure of saying that I have been there or for fame or glory. It is because I love it.
Men were always questioning whether she knew what she was talking about. At the end of a long climb, she was the one who was expected to spend 2 hours getting the snow to boil and cooking and cleaning up afterwards. There was always a power struggle.
In 1908, on her 6th attempt, Peck realized her dream to summit Mount Huascarán, the 4th highest peak in the Western Hemisphere. She was 58.
I am here at last, after all these years. I had climbed where no mortal before had stood, and higher than any man or woman now residing in the United States.
Annie Peck does have the altitude record, but that doesn't last very long because there's another woman climber named Fanny Bullock Workman, and Fanny climbs with her husband in the Himalayas. She also wants the title for highest peak. She hires a crew of engineers, and she spends $300,000, which is a lot of money, to go out and professionally triangulate the peak.
Despite losing her altitude record to Bullock Workman by 2,000 feet, Peck remained America's favorite woman climber.
She was on various advertisement campaigns. In 1910, every Singer sewing machine went out with a package of photographs and postcards of Annie Peck. One was called World's Famous Explorers, and it was a set of 25 male explorers and Annie.
Having published several books about Latin America, she lobbied the U.S. government to appoint her as an ambassador to the region, but was rejected for being too old and a woman. She became president of the Suffrage League, and in 1911 planted a Votes for Women banner at the top of Mount Kurapuna.
Peck sets a good example for others to follow. I carried the UN women's flag to the summit of K2, so I am dedicated to women's causes as well as science, conservation, geographic exploration. My hope is climbers start to really care, not how they change through the process, but what they can give back. If you weren't already a conservationist, by the time you climb the mountains with the glaciers receding, you realize what you have to lose and why it really matters.
In 1928, the North Peak of Huascaran was renamed Anya Peck. She summited her final mountain at age 82.
Peck is this inspirational figure, both in terms of climbing, but also in terms of women's rights, because we're still marching, we're still climbing, we're still demanding equality. And so we're essentially standing on the shoulders of this very unladylike figure who we're lucky enough to have had come before us.
I love her determination, focus, bravery. She didn't take no for an answer. She saw every setback as an opportunity.
Being always a firm believer in the equality of the sexes, I felt that any great achievement would be of great advantage to my sex. We should be free to do whatever we think we are qualified for.
Say I don't act right, it's unladylike, how I wanna live my life.
Thank you all for your patience. We did have a few minor technical glitches there with the audio, but I hope that you were still able to really see and appreciate what we were working very hard to do. As Charlotte mentioned, I think that this team was exceptional in being able to manage the tension between the production schedule, the volume of work we were generating at the pace at which we were generating it, and also maintaining a very high and innovative artistic quality. I mean, at the same time, we're dealing with issues of representation because many of the women that we're profiling were women of color. So we're merging artistic sensitivity as well as cultural sensitivity. And so these are all things that we attempted, and it's very interesting. We were working to create a visual vocabulary, a new visual vocabulary for historical documentaries, and hoping that it would appeal across generations. And I think based on some of the feedback we got from younger audiences, they really appreciated it. There was a 7-year-old boy in Texas who told his mom after watching our documentary on PBS that women did great things on Earth and everybody needed to know. And then someone else told us about, in Massachusetts, told us that their 12-year-old daughter every night, as a treat for doing her homework, was allowed the opportunity to watch one unladylike short a night. So that was kind of like a dessert, a creative and artistic dessert for her. So on the other hand, it was interesting that sometimes older audiences told us that they thought the pacing was too frenetic. Someone contacted us from a college and asked if we had another version of the shorts that they could use where the pacing was shorter, was slower. And we were like, this is what it is. This is what we created. So it'd be interesting to hear from you out in the audience how you feel about the pacing and the visuals and the style that we created. As I said, we're very proud of it. This team is exceptional. I think we were able to create so much together because of the trust and respect we have for each other. And it was a truly collaborative process.
Just to close out with the numbers to quantify that visual experience that you saw, we broke down for Annie Smith Peck, there were 614 different edits. This is in a 10.5-minute film. So that means the average is that some images were up for a second or less. So yes, it was very quick paced, almost like a TikTok meme. I think the typical frame in an average documentary is up for maybe 3 to 5 seconds. But I also think that's why youth are responding so well, and it makes this history feel really exciting to them. So I think we'll hand it back to Christina, who has some questions and open it up to questions from the audience.
Thank you guys so much. This was so amazing. And some of the people who are here were at the kind of teaser event that Charlotte did in 2018.
Yes.
When only one.
Thank you for coming back.
Well, and this was like the tragedy was the promise was that she would come back to Rhode Island in 2020, which of course became impossible. But one of the really fun things that night was at that point, there were only 2 Rhode Island women that we knew of. And so subsequently in research, it became apparent that Charlotta Spears Bass also had a Rhode Island connection. And I'm just wondering, I think you talked a little bit about this a couple of years ago, but thinking about these stories, and the idea behind the project is you're looking for people who are not well documented, or who were well documented, but there's not documentation now. And so how did the availability of documentation feed into who you were able to select? And were there ever stories where you got partway along and then couldn't, like it seemed like a great story, but you couldn't get far enough along and you had to abandon?
Yes, well, early on, I probably researched over 250 different women from this era in the course of my research, and had put together this massive spreadsheet that we ended up sharing with the scholars, the humanities scholars, and they helped us narrow down the wish list to about 50 women. And the criteria included, is there enough archive available to really tell this story in a meaningful way? Because often I only found one image, if that, for some of these women. And biographical details also were lacking. It was very important to me to give them back their voice as much as possible. So what also played into the decisions were whether we were able to find quotations from them, from their letters, from their diaries, some published memoirs, or gave interviews with the press when they were alive, because some of these women were very famous during their lives and then were forgotten. Annie Smith Peck, her biographer tells the story that essentially all of her papers were left, under the rain in a box, and somebody found it and gave the collection to a library here in Brooklyn where I live, thank God. With Sissieretta Jones, her biographer had to travel the entire country to find the images that you saw. It's spread across many different collections, and her voice was never recorded, even though recording technology did exist, and some white singers at the time, especially ones that were performing at such high profile venues as Madison Square Garden and Carnegie Hall, were recorded. But no one has yet to find a recording of her voice. And with Charlotta Bass, it was very late in the process, we actually found footage of her speech when she accepts the vice presidential nomination, and actually re-edited the film to start with the speech, because of course, wow, not only footage, but you can hear her voice was just so extraordinary. But just to close out, yes, there's a number of women that we wanted to feature. And in the end, part of the way through writing treatments about them, realized like there's just not enough there. However, I think if there were to be a season 2, Amelie and Joel proved that we can do a lot with very few archival images. One of our other women, Jovita Idar, who was a Latina journalist, I think we only have 4 portraits of her in all. And yet we were able to tell her story in great detail, thanks to the additional portraits that I maybe created. So I think the second time around, I might make some slightly different decisions. But we certainly went for diversity of socioeconomic background, racial ethnic background, geographical origins, the professions they chose. And I think we have a really pretty extraordinary mix of people, but there's so many other stories waiting to be told.
We have a comment from someone who says that she's certain she's part of your older viewership, but loves the frenetic quality.
Oh, thank you.
And wondering also, just had a question. After having accomplished this effort, what's next? What do you see as the to be discovered? And that's for all of you, I would say.
Well, one of the things that we wanted to do with Unladylike was to really look at the canon of American history and how American history is taught, and acknowledging that women, and women of color in particular, are pretty much erased from what's taught. The Smithsonian Museum of Women's History did analysis of grades K through 12 and found 767 heroic figures that are typically taught in states across the United States, and about 20% of them are women, most of whom are only mentioned once in passing, and some of whom are actually imaginary characters and aren't real. And so we, in addition to creating the educational curriculum, we are in the process of organizing a national conversation to really kind of look at how and why women are really absent in large part from what's taught in schools, and really trying to advocate for wider inclusion. And not just to have women to be taught for the sake of it, but because it's important for us to have a real, authentic, full representation of what has happened in this country, and the people who have helped to shape it and have helped to really provide access to democracy and to wider opportunities. So that's one of the things that Charlotte and I are doing in our spare time.
There's a partial question in the chat, and I'm going to guess at what might have been the predicate. And if I'm wrong, please correct me in the chat. Was animation part of the process? Here we go. Was animation part of the process because there were insufficient documents for some women, or was that a choice for a different reason?
Yes and no. When I first approached Amelie, and you'll remember maybe Amelie the day I rode over with my bicycle and we sat up on your rooftop, and I started telling you about some of these women, including I think Annie Smith Peck, and you were working on a project about mountaineering at the time. So you were
Louisa Arner Boyd.
And Louise Arner Boyd, who was a polar explorer. But yes, I biked over to your house because I had discovered these stories, but there wasn't enough archive. And so I thought, I need you to help me think, how could we supplement? Especially because photography at the time, people posed. So it's mainly still portraits, and certainly no action sequences. And those are the pivotal moment in their lives, right? When she makes it to the top of the Matterhorn, when she writes a letter and gets rejected from the president at Brown. And of course, there would never have been a photographer present for those moments. So yes, it was because documents were insufficient, but also in an attempt to really create this new visual form of historical storytelling, where, like my boys find black and white photography kind of boring. And the slow pan across an old photograph is certainly a very popular style, but we were really trying to find a way to make it come to life and be full of action. And that's also why we made the decision to interview modern day women who are walking in the footsteps of these women from the past, to really make this history echo and feel present and relevant to not only our present, but how the future might be shaped.
Yes.
I had another question for, I guess I actually had a lot of questions at the start, but the way that you guys did this presentation was so elucidating. I think one of the things that was really incredible was hearing Joel and Amelie talk about how to create movement and motion with stills and sometimes pictures that were not even of the actual person, but that way of getting our eye into the frame was just so brilliantly done. It was really remarkable.
I agree. Thank you.
And if you want to talk any more about that specifically, I don't know, or do you feel like you?
I mean, I would just add that definitely like animation is a very noble craft, a little bit like it makes me think about painting. It has this complexity. It requires time. It's very exigent. So to discover it, you know, through those amazing scripts and unbelievable stories and women, and then to be helped and supported, and sometimes he had like his own part of the creation by Joel, was really like an amazing thing to build up all together, because it's a very tricky craft. You know, I used to do a lot of drawing. Drawing is has amazing qualities because it's very immediate and simple, but then animation, and there's so many parameters. You have to think about space, you have to think about light, you have to think about the motion. And also, like, I want to meet, like what Charlotte was saying, we wanted in the same time to have this like kind of like very raw, immediate, strong rendering that is not too fluid, not too literal, not too, so we could keep up with the pace, you know, of the films and the pace of the archival. So that was like a very good challenge to a very interesting challenge to mix up all that together based on all those unbelievable stories.
Amelie was always, you were always saying, this is not Disney, you know, we're not a Pixar studio. We were really going for the hand-drawn stop motion feel. That was very important to us.
As organic as possible, as, you know, with his own kind of clumsiness. So, like, you know, that was the big talk, actually, I think, between Joel and I, was about like which clumsiness we keep, which one we, because clumsiness in the drawing is like poetry. That's where the viewer's eye can find a space to dream a little bit. So, you know, it's a very interesting thing it was so like unique to work all together, because there's so many layers. Not only you have those incredible women and all the work that you guys did, you know, on investigating and excavating their life, but then on top of it, we had also all those visual, like, you know, innovation to create that were like so like interesting for us. So,
well, it's very interesting because you all, in your own way, talked about the time pressure that you were under, but there's a way in which it's like the time frame became part of the creative process as well. Like if you had, you know, 6 years of just production time or whatever would have, you know, it seems like it's organically connected to the kind of the pace of the pieces themselves really beautifully.
The time frame was very interesting. I love also, like, that's very personal, but I love like very immediate painting, type of painting or drawings. I'm more like of a Rauschenberg school than, you know, a Warhol one. So I love that kind of, okay, let's do it in a few minutes. What if you have only a few minutes to do a portrait? How do you capture the soul of someone, the eyes, and just a few strokes? And so we had that in the background when we could do it, of course, when we didn't have only to do like historical reenactments or much more little literal things that were very funny to do. But we had also that space for that. That was very interesting. And I think Joel like was very much like, you know, creative with it as well.
Well, because especially, I mean, I think when you're looking at an archival photograph, and maybe particularly in the cases where, again, we were looking at an image that wasn't necessarily the person. And so you know that it's atmospheric, or it's like, it's helping you understand the context. But then suddenly when one part of it comes into color and begins to swirl, it's like your own mind, you're reminded in this very visceral way, these were real people who moved around just like we do. And so it's just really brilliantly and economically done. So
thank you. Yeah, it was all about like injecting life into that, and by little touches, little strokes here and there. It was a lot of like strokes all around. So
it also reminded me, there's a, I can't remember the name of it, but there was a book that I read that years ago, that a critic talking about how writers who were writing before there was photography and before even there was imagery that would go with writing. So even back to like pre-writing, but to oral, like people telling stories orally, that there are certain ways that writers have of creating images in your mind, and certain things happen, like something moves in a corner, something moves across, like there are things that our brains connect to, or flames. Yeah. And I had forgotten about this book, but I was thinking a lot about it when watching this, because you didn't have a lot to work with, and what you brought to it is what made it come alive in this really amazing way.
Oh yeah, great.
If I can add
that. That's a success.
If I can add, because Amelie used the word reenactment, traditionally with historical films, when archive is limited, at least, I have been in my career now for 20 years. I would say in the first 15 years of my career, the main way that I saw history being portrayed was through actual reenactments, where they put actors in costumes and do these kind of hokey, they try to put them in a period looking room, and so it's pretending to be kind of like a fictionalized version of the history, but you never have the budget that a Hollywood film has. So it always looks kind of low budget and hokey to me. So that was never, like that was one option that I was sure I would not take. And animation was just starting to be used more in documentary films, 8 years ago or so, when I first had the idea. And so I think, it was like, oh, I prefer this approach. It's much more poetic. And
I know, yeah, of course. No, I was not using the right term. I was thinking when we would be closer to the action, to make sure that is, very understandable. Because there's a very big difference, like in the anime, when we did the work, and you have to really show an action, and it has to be, you have a certain level of readability, like to be able to really read it. That leaves, that's so interesting, but that leaves less space to, something more like artistic and poetic. For example, when you show like a very specific action of a hand putting something somewhere, you're still going to have a lot there, like in terms of texture and like, the design and everything. But then when you open up to like a bigger space, and you can leave that, thing, that mission, and you go for like painting, you go like paint a landscape, when we were like for Annie Smith Peck, for example, with all the mountains and the summits, then you enter a more pictorial area. That's what I was really talking about. It's not, of course, pure reenactment at all. It's just like we had to like oscillate between like being like very close to the action and the story, to very like much wider poetic and creative
imaginations.
Yeah, and imagination. That was a lot of fun to mix it together. And actually you could see, like when Charlotte was showing all the different layers, the mountains were made of like, this very like spontaneous watercolor, a little bit out of control, on very like large paper, while the character was much more defined. So the contrast was actually very interesting visually to create. Yeah.
Well, thank you all so, so much. It was so exciting to see all this beautiful work. And Alice just put the Twitter and Facebook connection in, and I hope that everybody will watch all the rest of the films as well, which are—
Yes, they're all available on our website at unladylike2020.com, as well as on the PBS website, PBS American Masters.
Thank you again.
And if you have any school-age children, we have tailor-made for the remote learning era. We have curriculum that you can find through our website as well.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you for having us, and thank you to Rich for making this event possible.
Thank you, PPL.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Joel.